Part 2. The Revelation. Clarity is spiritual. Chapter 4. God is not the author of confusion. There is a point where the conversation about clarity must move beyond strategy and enter something deeper. Until now, we have spoken about clarity in practical terms, how it affects trust, opportunity, influence, and outcomes. But clarity is not only a practical matter. It is not merely a communication technique or a professional advantage. At its core, clarity is spiritual. This is where everything begins to shift. Because once clarity is seen as spiritual, it can no longer be treated as optional. Scripture states this plainly. God is not the author of confusion. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33. This is not just a statement about order in a gathering. It is a revelation about the nature of God Himself. It tells us something fundamental, that confusion does not come from Him. It is not part of His character. It is not how He operates. It is not how He communicates. And if confusion is not from Him, then clarity must reflect Him. To understand this, consider how God reveals Himself. From the beginning, His communication has always been intentional. When He speaks, there is direction. When He gives instruction, there is meaning. When He reveals truth, it is not hidden in confusion. It is expressed in a way that can be received. Even when things are not fully understood immediately, they are not designed to be permanently unclear. There is always a path toward understanding. There is always a way forward. God does not create uncertainty for its own sake. He brings light where there is darkness. He brings understanding where there is ignorance. He brings order where there is chaos. Clarity is consistent with His nature. This is why confusion has such strong consequences. Confusion disrupts alignment. It creates hesitation. It introduces doubt. It makes it difficult for people to move forward with confidence. And because of this, confusion becomes a barrier, not only in practical matters, but in spiritual ones as well. If a person does not understand what is being communicated, they cannot respond properly. If they cannot respond, they cannot act. And if they cannot act, they remain where they are. This is why clarity is necessary for transformation. God does not only want to speak, He wants to be understood. Because understanding is what makes response possible. When you begin to see clarity this way, your approach to communication changes. It is no longer about sounding impressive. It is no longer about appearing knowledgeable. It is no longer about using language that creates distance. Instead, it becomes about removing anything that prevents understanding. Because if your communication creates confusion, it does not reflect the nature of God. This is a serious realization. It means that clarity is not simply a skill to develop. It is a responsibility to uphold. This applies in every area of life. In leadership, if direction is unclear, those who follow will struggle. Not because they are incapable, but because they do not understand what is required. Confusion at the top creates disorder throughout the system. In business, if the message is unclear, the market will not respond. Not because the offering lacks value, but because that value has not been made visible. People cannot engage with what they do not understand. In relationships, If communication is unclear, misunderstanding will grow, and over time, this leads to distance, even when there is no ill intention. And in ministry, the consequences are even more significant. If truth is not communicated clearly, people cannot receive it. And if they cannot receive it, it cannot produce change in their lives. Clarity is not a preference, it is necessary. There is also a tendency to associate complexity with depth, to assume that something is more valuable if it is more difficult to understand. But this is not always true. Depth does not require confusion. In fact, true depth often becomes clearer, not more complicated. It becomes more refined, more focused, more accessible. This is seen in how Jesus communicated. He did not remove depth from his message, but he removed unnecessary complexity. He spoke in ways that people could grasp. He used language that connected with everyday life. He ensured that those who were willing to listen could understand, because the goal was not to impress, the goal was to reveal. If God is not the author of confusion, then confusion must be addressed wherever it is found. It must be identified. It must be reduced. It must be removed, not aggressively, but intentionally. Because clarity requires effort. It requires discipline. It requires the willingness to simplify without losing meaning, to refine without removing truth, to communicate in a way that serves the listener, not just the speaker. This is where many people struggle. It is easier to speak than it is to be understood. It is easier to say more than it is to say what matters. It is easier to remain vague than it is to be precise. But clarity demands precision. There is also a personal dimension to this. Clarity is not only about how you communicate outwardly, it is also about how you understand inwardly. If you are unclear within yourself, your communication will reflect that. If your thinking is disordered, your expression will be disordered. If your purpose is undefined, your message will lack direction. Clarity begins internally before it is expressed externally. This means that pursuing clarity is not only about improving communication, it is about aligning your thinking, your intentions, and your understanding. Because what is unclear within will eventually become unclear without. As within, so without. Hermetic philosophy. This leads to a final reflection. If God is not the author of confusion, then clarity is not something you pursue alone. It is something you align with. You do not create clarity from nothing. You seek it. You refine it. You allow it to shape how you think, how you speak, and how you act. And as you do, your communication begins to change. It becomes simpler. It becomes more direct. It becomes more effective. Not because it has less meaning, but because it has removed what was unnecessary. Take a moment to consider this. Where in your life is there confusion? Where in your communication is there unnecessary complexity? Where might your message be clear to you, but unclear to others? These are important questions. Because clarity is not automatic, it is intentional. And when it is pursued with understanding, it becomes more than a skill. It becomes a reflection of alignment with truth, with purpose, and with the nature of God Himself. Clarity is not just strategic, it is divine. Chapter 5. The Gospel is simple. There is a common assumption that depth must be complex. that if something is truly profound, it must also be difficult to understand. Many people carry this belief, often without realizing it. They equate simplicity with shallowness and complexity with intelligence. As a result, they communicate in ways that sound impressive but leave people confused. But when we look at how truth is revealed in Scripture, we see something different. The gospel is simple. So simple you need a pastor to confuse you. The gospel is not shallow, not reduced, not lacking in meaning, but simple, clear, understandable. And this simplicity is not an accident, it is intentional. If we observe how Jesus communicated, we begin to see a pattern. He carried truth of the highest depth, truth about God, about the human heart, about eternity. Yet when he spoke, he did not rely on complexity to express it. He did not use language that created distance. He did not speak in a way that only a few could understand. He spoke in a way that made truth accessible. In Matthew 13, we see this clearly. Jesus uses parables, simple stories drawn from everyday life. A farmer sowing seeds, a lamp being lit, a field, a harvest, a seed growing over time. These were not abstract ideas. They were familiar images, things people could see, relate to, and understand. But within these simple expressions was deep truth. This is important. Pay attention. Because it shows that simplicity does not remove depth, it reveals it. The parables were not shallow stories. They were structured in a way that allowed people to enter into understanding gradually. Those who were willing to listen could grasp their meaning. Those who were not would hear the words but miss the truth. This reveals something important about clarity. Clarity is not about making things smaller. It is about making things visible. When something is clear, it can be seen. It can be understood. It can be engaged with. But when something is hidden behind unnecessary complexity, it becomes inaccessible, even if it is valuable. Jesus did not hide truth behind complexity. He revealed it through clarity. This challenges the way many people think about communication. There is often a tendency to make things more complicated than they need to be, to use language that sounds advanced, to structure ideas in a way that appears sophisticated, but this does not always lead to understanding. In many cases, it does the opposite. It creates distance between the message and the listener. It requires more effort to process what is being said. It introduces friction, and when there is too much friction, people disengage. This is why simplicity matters, not because it reduces meaning, but because it removes barriers. The goal of communication is not to display knowledge, it is to transfer understanding. This is a key distinction. You cannot know something deeply and still fail to communicate it clearly. And if it is not communicated clearly, it cannot produce impact, regardless of how valuable it is. Jesus did not aim to impress people with how much he knew. He aimed to ensure that what he carried could be understood. This is what made his communication effective. There is also a discipline involved in simplicity. It is not always easy to express something clearly. In fact, it often requires more effort than complexity. To simplify something, You must first understand it deeply. You must be able to separate what is essential from what is not. You must remove what is unnecessary without losing meaning. This requires clarity of thought before clarity of expression. This is why simplicity is not weakness, it is strength. It shows that something has been fully processed, that it has been refined, that it has been understood well enough to be communicated clearly. In practical terms, this has implications for how we speak, teach, lead, and create. If your message is not understood, its value remains hidden. If people cannot follow your thinking, they cannot respond to it. And if they cannot respond, nothing changes. This applies in every context. In teaching, clarity determines whether learning takes place. In leadership, clarity determines whether direction is followed. In business, clarity determines whether value is recognized. In ministry, clarity determines whether truth is received. In each case, simplicity plays a role, not by removing depth, but by making depth accessible. There is also a tendency to assume that making something simple means leaving things out. But this is not necessarily the case. Simplicity is not about omission, it is about focus. It is about identifying what matters most and expressing it in a way that can be understood. It is about guiding attention toward what is essential rather than overwhelming it with what is not. Jesus did this consistently. He did not attempt to say everything at once. He focused. He revealed truth in parts, in ways that people could grasp and build upon. This made his message both deep and clear. This leads to a necessary reflection. Again, if the gospel itself is simple, then our approach to communication must reflect that. We must be willing to remove unnecessary complexity, to speak in ways that can be understood, to prioritize clarity over appearance, because the goal is not to sound deep, think deep, but the goal is to be understood. Take a moment to consider your own communication. Where might you be adding complexity that is not necessary? Where might your message be clear to you but not to others? Where could simplicity make what you carry more accessible? These are important questions because clarity does not happen by accident. It is the result of intentional efforts. The gospel is simple, not because it lacks depth, but because it is meant to be understood. And if truth is to produce transformation, it must first be received. And if it is to be received, it must be clear. Simplicity is not the absence of depth, it is the pathway to it. Chapter 6. Understanding is the gateway to transformation. There is a step that is often overlooked when people think about change. Many focus on action. Some focus on belief. Others focus on efforts. But before any of these can take place, something else must happen first. Understanding. Transformation does not begin with action. It begins with understanding. Because until something is understood, it cannot be received. And until it is received, it cannot produce change. This is simple, but it is often ignored. People cannot respond to what they do not understand. Scripture makes this clear in a direct and practical way. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? Romans chapter 10 verse 14. This verse reveals a sequence. Hearing leads to understanding. Understanding leads to belief. Belief leads to a response. If any part of this sequence is broken, the process stops. And in many cases, the breakdown happens at the level of understanding. The message is spoken, but it is not understood. And because it is not understood, it cannot be believed. And because it is not believed, there is no response. This is why clarity matters. In evangelism, this becomes especially important. The goal is not simply to speak. The goal is for the message to be understood, because it is only when the message is understood that it can be received, and only when it is received that it can lead to transformation. This means that the responsibility of the one communicating is not only to be accurate, but to be clear. Truth that is not understood cannot produce its intended effect. This does not reduce the power of truth. It reveals the importance of how it is communicated. There is often an assumption that if something is true, it will automatically produce results. But this is not always the case. Truth must be received to be effective, and reception requires understanding. If a person hears words but does not grasp their meaning, the words remain external. They do not take root. They do not influence thinking. They do not produce change. Understanding is what allows truth to move from the outside to the inside. This principle is not limited to spiritual matters. It applies in every area of life. In learning, a person cannot apply what they do not understand. They may memorize information, but without understanding, it cannot be used effectively. In leadership, people cannot follow direction they do not understand. They may attempt to act, but without clarity, their actions will lack alignment. In business, customers cannot engage with value they do not understand. They may see what is presented, but if its meaning is unclear, they will move on. In each case, understanding is what enables response. This is why communication must be intentional. It is not enough to say something once and assume it has been understood. It is not enough to present information and assume it has been received. Understanding must be considered, pursued, and confirmed. It requires attention. It requires awareness of how others are receiving what is being communicated. It requires the willingness to adjust, to refine, and to simplify where necessary, because the goal is not expression alone, it is understanding. There is also a personal dimension to this. Understanding is not only something we seek to create in others, it is something we must seek within ourselves. If we do not fully understand what we carry, we cannot communicate it clearly. If our thinking is unclear, our expression will reflect that. Clarity in communication begins with clarity in understanding. This means taking the time to think carefully, to process deeply, to ensure that what we are communicating is not only true, but understood by us first. Because what is unclear within will become unclear without. As within, so without. Transformation is not automatic. It follows a process. And at the center of that process is understanding. Without understanding, there is no belief. Without belief, there is no response. Without response, there is no change. This is why clarity is essential. It ensures that what is communicated can be understood, and when it is understood, it becomes possible for it to be received, believed, and acted upon. Take a moment to reflect. Where might people be hearing you but not understanding you? Where might your message be accurate but unclear? Where might the lack of understanding be limiting response? These questions are important because they reveal where clarity is needed. Understanding is the gateway. It is the point at which possibility becomes reality. It is the moment where something moves from being external to internal. It is where change begins. Without it, nothing moves forward. With it, everything becomes possible. Clarity makes understanding possible. Understanding makes transformation possible. Again, this is why clarity matters.